Hello my dear friends, I'm Edward, and I'm truly happy you found your way here to Gentle Mysteries this evening. It's wonderful how these stories connect us, from cosy cottages in the English countryside to wherever you're settling down tonight in this big wide world. Before we begin, I'd love to know in the comments, do you remember the first time a quiet, ordinary place made you feel that something was not quite right? Don't forget to subscribe so our little cozy community can keep growing and warming hearts with stories every single day. Now settle in, wrap up in your blanket, and let's begin tonight's mystery. Chapter 1, The Morning Constitutional. Good evening, dear friends, and welcome back to Warm Pages. I'm Edward, and I cannot tell you how genuinely glad I am to see so many of you gathering here with me tonight. Whether you're tucked up in a quiet corner of Lancashire, listening from a sun-warmed veranda somewhere in New Zealand, or perhaps stealing a few peaceful moments before the household wakes in Canada, you are precisely where you ought to be. I read every single one of your comments, and last week a lovely listener named Margaret from Dorset told me that these stories had become her Tuesday evening ritual, complete with a pot of Earl Grey and her late mother's crocheted blanket. Margaret, if you're with us again tonight, that truly warmed my heart. Now, before we begin, I have a small question for our cosy community this evening, one that fits our story rather perfectly. Do you remember the last time a perfectly ordinary, perfectly familiar place suddenly felt wrong to you? Not frightening exactly, just off. The way a room looks when someone has moved a single ornament 2 inches to the left, and you cannot immediately say why the space has unsettled you, only that it has. Do leave your thoughts in the comments. I find that the most observant people amongst us, people very much like Miss Marple herself, always have a story about exactly that sensation. And that, my friends, is where tonight's mystery begins. In a place no one would ever think to look twice at. In a place that smelled of clean wood, dried lavender, and good honest carbolic soap. In the pharmacy of St. Mary Mead. The morning of the 14th of October arrived in St. Mary Mead the way most October mornings did. Gently and with a great deal of grey. The elm trees along the high street had begun surrendering their leaves in earnest, and the pavements were slick with a fine mist that had settled overnight and showed no intention of leaving before noon. Miss Jane Marple, as was her custom at 8:30 on a dry enough morning, was undertaking what she privately called her reconnoitring walk, though she would never have used such a military term aloud, it being, in her estimation, somewhat unseemly for a lady of her years. To the village she was simply an elderly woman taking the air, pausing to admire the late chrysanthemums in Mrs. Bartlett's front garden, or to exchange a word with young Thomas the butcher's boy about whether the Michaelmas geese had come in yet. But Miss Marple saw everything. She noted, for instance, that the new curtains in the Solicitor Mr. Pethwick's office window were drawn on the left side but not the right, a curious asymmetry for so precise a man. She noted that the post office had received an unusually large delivery that morning, 2 crates rather than the usual one, and that Mrs. Doris Fenn, the postmistress, had signed for them herself rather than letting young Gerald do it, which suggested something she did not wish a boy of 19 to handle without supervision. She noted the smell of fresh paint from the direction of the village hall 2 weeks before the autumn fair. Someone was in a great hurry. And she noted with a particular and very quiet attentiveness that the pharmacy on the corner of Church Lane and the High Street, Prescott and Son, Dispensing Chemists, established 1887, had its side door standing open at 23 minutes past 8 in the morning. A full 7 minutes before Mr. Gerald Prescott was known by long and reliable village tradition to unlock the front door. Miss Marple stopped. She adjusted her gloves. She always wore gloves on her morning walk, pale grey ones that had been her sister's, and she looked at the open side door for precisely the length of time it took her to remember something that had nothing whatsoever to do with pharmacies. She remembered old Mr. Twitchett, the ironmonger in St. Mary Mead 30 years ago, who had always kept his back door locked on account of his apprentice having a habit of pilfering turpentine, and she remembered the day that Mr. Twitchett had left it unlocked, only once, only briefly, and what that had eventually led to. She walked on. But the open door stayed with her, the way a wrong note in a familiar hymn will stay with a person all through the sermon and beyond. It was not until she had turned back up Church Lane on her return and was passing the pharmacy once more, the front door properly open now, the open sign turned squarely in the window, that she saw Mrs. Edith Harlow come out. Mrs. Harlow was 61 years old, a widow of 7 years, and the closest thing the village had to a fixture. She had lived above the bakery on Pump Street all her life, had nursed her husband through his final illness with remarkable composure, and collected her nerve tonic from Prescott's every 2 weeks, with the punctuality of the church clock. She was a small, tidy woman with a brown coat that was very clean and always a little too large for her, as though she were slowly and gently disappearing inside it. She came out of the pharmacy holding her small white paper bag, the same shape, the same folded top, and she smiled at Miss Marple as she passed. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Dreadful mist, isn't it?" "Good morning, Mrs. Harlow. Yes, rather. Are you keeping well?" "Oh, quite well, thank you. Just collecting my tonic," she walked on. Miss Marple watched her go. There it was again, that sensation. Not fear, not even suspicion precisely. Only a note that did not quite belong in the chord. Because Mrs. Harlow's prescription was due on the 17th. Miss Marple knew this because she knew everything about the routines of St. Mary Mead, and because the 17th was also the day of the Mothers' Union coffee morning, and Mrs. Harlow never missed the coffee morning, and had been observed to collect her tonic on her way home from it for the past 3 years without variation. Today was the 14th. Miss Marple tucked this small, unremarkable fact into the same mental drawer where she kept the open side door, and she walked home for her own breakfast with the distinct and very familiar feeling that St. Mary Mead was about to require her full attention. She was quite right. By 11 o'clock that same morning, Mrs. Edith Harlow was dead. Chapter 2. The Folded Bag. The news reached Miss Marple the way most news reached her, not through any official channel, and certainly not through Inspector Slack, who would not have thought to inform an elderly spinster of anything at all, had she been standing directly beside him at the time, but through Mrs. Clara Weatherby, who had heard it from young Thomas the butcher's boy, who had heard it from Gerald Prescott himself, who had come out of the pharmacy white as a fresh dispensing label, and told the first person he met on the high street that Mrs. Harlow had been found collapsed in her own front passage by her neighbour, Mrs. Ida Cope, at approximately 10 minutes past 10. Miss Marple received this information while standing in her kitchen, still in her morning cardigan, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone rather cold. She listened to every word Mrs. Weatherby had to offer, and Mrs. Weatherby had a great many words, delivered at considerable pace and with much adjustment of her hat, and she said very little in return, which Mrs. Weatherby took for grief and Miss Marple intended as concentration. When Mrs. Weatherby had gone, Miss Marple set down her cup, picked up her knitting from the basket beside the kitchen dresser, and sat for a long moment looking at the garden without seeing it. She was thinking about the folded bag. It was a small thing, the sort of thing that Inspector Slack would have waved aside with the particular impatience he reserved for observations he considered irrelevant. But Miss Marple had spent a great many years noticing small things, and she had come to understand that in matters of human behaviour it was precisely the small things that told the truth when everything larger was conspiring to lie. Mrs. Harlow had been a tidy woman, meticulous even, the kind of woman who folded brown paper bags flat before placing them in the kitchen drawer, who rinsed her milk bottles before putting them on the step, who replaced buttons the moment they loosened rather than waiting until they fell. Miss Marple had visited Mrs. Harlow's home on 3 occasions, twice for the Mothers' Union Committee, and once to return a borrowed copy of the Illustrated London News, and the impression of orderliness had been absolute and entirely genuine. A woman of that character, collecting a paper bag from the pharmacy, would hold it by the top. She would keep it level. She would, or in all likelihood, tuck it neatly into her basket rather than carry it loose in her hand at all. But Mrs. Harlow this morning had been carrying the bag in her right hand, unfolded, with the top merely pressed together rather than crisp, as though the bag had been opened and reclosed in a hurry, as though something had been checked, or adjusted inside it, or removed, or added. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked twice, and then stopped. She reached instead for her small leather notepad, the one she kept in the left-hand pocket of her cardigan for exactly this sort of morning, and she wrote 3 things in her neat, unhurried hand. Side door open. 8:23 a.m. Prescription collected 3 days early. Bag opened before reaching home. She looked at the 3 lines for a moment. Then she added a 4th. Who else was in the pharmacy? The answer to that question required a delicate sort of investigation, the kind that Inspector Slack was congenitally incapable of conducting, because it depended entirely on the appearance of not investigating anything at all. Miss Marple achieved this by the simple method of requiring some throat lozenges. She presented herself at Prescott's at 11:20, her basket on her arm, and her expression one of mild and slightly forgetful benevolence. Gerald Prescott was behind the counter. He was always behind the counter, a thin young man of 32 who had the defeated quality of someone who had inherited a life rather than chosen one. His father, old Arthur Prescott, had died 4 years ago and left Gerald not only the pharmacy, but also the considerable weight of the Prescott reputation for reliability, discretion, and an absolute correctness in all dispensing matters. Gerald's hands, Miss Marple noticed at once, were not quite steady. "Good morning, Mr. Prescott. I'm so sorry to hear about poor Mrs. Harlow. Such a dreadful shock." "Yes." He reached for the lozenges without being told the variety, which was a small courtesy, she noted. "Yes, it's quite dreadful, Miss Marple. Her heart, they're saying." "I imagine so." A pause that was slightly too long. "She did have a heart condition. She'd been on the tonic for, quite some time." "Of course." Miss Marple accepted the lozenges and her change and made no move to leave. "She came in this morning, didn't she? I passed her on the street. She seemed quite her usual self." "She did come in, yes." Gerald's eyes moved briefly, involuntarily. Yes, toward the far end of the counter, toward the dispensing hatch, where a wooden flap separated the public part of the shop from the back room. "She collected her prescription. Early, wasn't it? I thought she usually came on the 17th. The pause this time was fractionally shorter, overcompensated for, Miss Marple thought. "We had a telephone call yesterday afternoon. She said she was running low." "Ah," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "Of course." She bought her lozenges. She left. But as she reached the door, she turned back, not sharply, not meaningfully, but with the natural vagueness of a woman who has nearly forgotten something. "I don't suppose young Miss Lorimer was in this morning. I thought I might ask her about the fair arrangements." Gerald Prescott's face did something very small and very interesting. "Miss Lorimer?" No, she doesn't come in until Thursday." "Oh, of course. How silly of me. Good morning, Mr. Prescott." She walked out into the mist. Miss Tessa Lorimer was Gerald Prescott's dispensing assistant. She had held the position for 18 months. She was 26 years old, clever, and, this being St. Mary Mead, her personal circumstances were not unknown to those who paid attention. Her mother had been ill for 2 years. There were debts. There was a younger brother at a school in Shropshire whose fees required a financial act of faith each term. There was, Miss Marple reflected, a considerable distance between what Miss Lorimer earned and what Miss Lorimer required. She did not come in until Thursday, and yet the side door had been open at 23 minutes past 8. Miss Marple walked home through the mist, her throat lozenges in her basket and 4 more entries in her notepad. Gerald's hands, unsteady. Eyes went to dispensing hatch. Claimed Harlow telephoned Reura running low. Verify. Lorimer, Thursday only, but side door. She paused at her garden gate and looked back at the grey October sky above the elm trees, and she thought of Mrs. Harlow in her brown coat that was always slightly too large, walking away down the high street for the last time with an unfolded bag in her hand. "The simplest explanation," Miss Marple said quietly to no one in particular, "is very rarely simple at all." She went inside, put the kettle on, and added one final note to the page. Check the poison register. Chapter 3. The Register and the Razored Page. Inspector Dermot Slack arrived in St. Mary Mead at 12:30, which Miss Marple considered rather later than the situation warranted, though she kept this opinion entirely to herself. He came in his black motor car with Constable Doris Ferry beside him, a sensible young woman whom Miss Marple thought wasted on slack, rather in the way that a good pair of scissors is wasted on someone who insists on tearing things. And he went directly to Mrs. Harlow's cottage on Pump Street, without stopping to speak to anyone on the High Street, which was, in Miss Marple's estimation, his first mistake of what promised to be a considerable collection. She heard all of this from her front garden, where she was engaged in the wholly legitimate activity of cutting back her Michaelmas daisies, and from Mrs. Clara Weatherby, who appeared at the garden gate at 1 o'clock with the information that Dr. Haydock had already been and gone, had written cardiac arrest on his preliminary notes, and had told Inspector Slack that there was, in his professional opinion, nothing to suggest anything other than a sad but entirely natural death. "Natural causes," Mrs. Weatherby said, with the satisfied gravity of someone delivering the closing line of a sermon. Poor dear, her heart, just as everyone said. Yes, said Miss Marple, just as everyone said. She clipped a daisy stem with perhaps slightly more precision than was strictly necessary. Dr. Haydock called on Miss Marple himself at 2:15, which she had expected. He was one of the few people in St. Mary Mead who did not consider her observations a symptom of advanced age, or possibly because he was 71 himself and had long since stopped apologising for the acuity of his own. He accepted a cup of tea, declined a biscuit, and settled into the armchair by the window with the practised comfort of a man who had sat in it many times before. "You don't believe it," he said. It was not a question. "I didn't say anything of the sort, Robert. You didn't need to. You have your notepad out." Miss Marple looked down at the small leather notepad on the table beside her knitting and said nothing, which was its own variety of confirmation. Dr. Haydock turned his cup in its saucer. Clinically, there is nothing definitive. She had a documented arrhythmia. She was on digitalis-based tonic, had been for 8 months. The presentation is entirely consistent with cardiac failure. Entirely consistent, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. And is it consistent with anything else? A pause. Digitalis toxicity, he said at last quietly. An excessive dose of the same compound she was already taking would produce an almost indistinguishable result. Nausea, visual disturbance, a catastrophic arrhythmia. In someone already compromised, he stopped. But that would require a significant miscalculation in the dispensing, or a deliberate one. And the window of uncertainty, in the time of death. Haydock set his cup down. An hour, perhaps a little more. She was found at 10:10. Death could have occurred any time from shortly after 9, he looked at her steadily. Which is to say, it could have occurred shortly after she took her morning dose. Immediately upon returning home. Yes, Miss Marple said. That is rather what I thought. She picked up her knitting, turned it once, and then put it down again. Robert, is there any possibility of a proper toxicological examination? Slack has ruled it a natural death. Slack, said Miss Marple, with the diplomatic restraint of a woman who has had many years of practice, is not a toxicologist. Haydock was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I'll make a telephone call this afternoon. I cannot promise anything, but I can express certain reservations to the coroner, as a private professional concern, and request that the matter not be closed with undue haste. He rose, straightening his coat. In the meantime, Jane, I would suggest that whatever you are planning to do next, you do it before Slack decides to have a word with the pharmacy himself and puts everyone thoroughly on their guard. I had already considered that, Miss Marple said. I was planning to visit the pharmacy again at 4 o'clock. Whatever for? To collect my prescription for iron tablets. She looked up at him with mild blue eyes. I've been meaning to for several days. It would be quite remiss of me to put it off any longer. The pharmacy at 4 o'clock was a different creature from the pharmacy at 11:30. The mist had solidified into a thin, determined drizzle, and the warm light from inside the shop fell in amber rectangles across the wet pavement of Church Lane, making the whole corner look rather like an illustration from a Christmas annual. 2 women were ahead of Miss Marple at the counter, Mrs. Perks collecting a cough preparation for her youngest, and old Mr. Denny, who came every Tuesday for his liver pills and stayed considerably longer than was strictly required for the transaction. This suited Miss Marple admirably. While Gerald Prescott measured and packaged and made conversation with Mr. Denny about the likelihood of a hard winter, Miss Marple stood near the far end of the counter, beside the low shelf of patent tonics and vitamin preparations, and looked with quiet and unhurried attention at the dispensing hatch. The wooden flap was down and latched from this side, the public side, but the latch was a simple one, a small brass hook that any adult could have reached over and lifted in under 3 seconds, and on the counter beside the hatch just at the edge was the poison register. It was a large, black-bound ledger with a red spine, the sort used in pharmacies to record every dispensing of a scheduled substance, required by law and inspected quarterly. Miss Marple had known it was there because she had known it had to be there, and because she had spent the walk from her cottage rehearsing, in her precise way, exactly where she would need to stand in order to see it without appearing to look at it at all. She was not able to read the entries from where she stood. She had not expected to. But she could see the page to which the register was currently open, and what she saw on that page made her be very still for a moment, behind the comfortable cover of examining a bottle of iron tonic. The page was open somewhere in the middle of the book, but the left-hand page was not uniform. Halfway down, the surface of the paper had a very slight, very faint difference in sheen. Not a tear, not a smudge. The particular flat smoothness of paper over which paste has been applied and allowed to dry. Something had been pasted over. A label, a slip of paper, an entry concealed beneath another entry. Miss Marple replaced the iron tonic on the shelf with care. Mr. Denny concluded his remarks about the winter and shuffled toward the door, and Miss Marple presented herself at the counter with her prescription and her most comfortably inconsequential expression. "So sorry to keep you waiting, Miss Marple." Gerald Prescott was professional and smooth. Smoother than the morning, she noted. He had recovered himself. Someone had helped him do so, or he had had time enough to manage it alone. "Not at all, Mr. Prescott. One does like to browse." She glanced just once at the register. Then she looked back at Gerald. "Tell me," she said pleasantly, as he reached for her iron tablets. "Do you keep all your poison registers on the counter? I had always imagined they were kept in the safe." Gerald's hand paused, only for a half-second, but Miss Marple's eyes were old and very well trained. "We move it out during dispensing hours," he said, "for ease of reference. It's locked away at closing." "Of course," said Miss Marple. "How very sensible." She paid for her iron tablets, said good evening, and walked out into the drizzle. By the time she reached her gate, the notepad entry was already composed in her mind, word for word. Register on counter, left page, pasted entry, midsection. Recent, paste still faintly raised at edges. Gerald smoother this afternoon, coached or composed. Which? And who, she added almost as an afterthought, keeps the key to the dispensing room when Miss Lorimer is not here? She went inside to write her notes and to sit with the question for a while, the way one sits with a difficult piece of knitting, not pulling at it, not forcing it, but allowing the pattern to declare itself in its own time. It would. They always did. Chapter 4. The Dispensing Assistant. Miss Tessa Lorimer lived in the upper half of a narrow terraced house on Willow Dip Lane, a street that ran behind the church and was considered, by the more established residents of St. Mary Mead, to occupy a position in the village's social geography that was respectable without being quite comfortable. The houses there were clean and well kept, net curtains properly white, front steps properly scrubbed, but they had the particular quality of homes in which considerable effort was being made to maintain appearances that required rather more effort than they once had. Miss Marple understood this quality intimately. She had seen it many times. It was the architecture of quiet financial anxiety. She had not, of course, gone to Willow Dip Lane directly. That would have been, as she explained to herself, clipping her words with the precision she applied to most things, unseemly. A woman calling uninvited upon a young person she barely knew, the morning after the girl's employer had lost a customer, would look either ghoulish or purposeful, and Miss Marple had no intention of looking either. Instead, she had gone to see the vicar. The Reverend Gerald Clement received Miss Marple in his study at 10 o'clock on the morning of the 15th, which was a Thursday, and which meant, as Miss Marple had been careful to confirm, that Miss Tessa Lorimer would be at the pharmacy until 6 in the evening. One liked to be certain that conversations could not be reported back before one had finished having them. The vicar was a gentle and slightly distracted man of 54 who had the useful quality of believing that most people who came to see him came because they were in some form of spiritual or pastoral difficulty. This meant that he asked rather fewer direct questions than might otherwise have been inconvenient. "I was so sorry to hear about Mrs. Harlow," Miss Marple began, accepting her customary cup of thin tea and settling into the chair across the cluttered desk. "A great blow to the parish, I should think. She was a faithful attendant." 42 years, the vicar said with genuine sadness. "Since her confirmation. I shall miss her very much. I believe she had no immediate family remaining. No, a niece in Northampton, Margaret, I think, who I understand she was not close to. The estate will go to her in due course, I imagine. Though I don't believe there is a great deal of it." He paused. "She did tell me some months ago that she'd recently had her will revised. There was some small legacy to the Church Restoration Fund, which was very generous of her." "When you say revised," Miss Marple said, with the careful vagueness of someone making polite conversation, rather than conducting an inquiry, "you mean she changed it? From something prior?" "I believe Mr. Pethwick drew up an amendment. She didn't say precisely, it wasn't my place to ask. but she did mention that she had decided to be rather more specific about certain items of personal property. The vicar frowned thoughtfully. She seemed, I noticed at the time, rather more settled in her manner than she had been in previous months, as though something had been resolved. "How interesting," said Miss Marple. "One does find that putting one's affairs in order brings a certain peace of mind." "Quite so," the vicar agreed. Miss Marple set down her cup. "I wonder, did you know Miss Lorimer at all? The young woman who works at the pharmacy. I ask because I had thought to invite her to the Mothers' Union Christmas planning meeting, and I wasn't certain whether she was a churchgoer." The vicar brightened slightly. He always brightened when given the opportunity to account for his parishioners. "Oh, Tessa. Yes, she comes to the early service on Sundays, fairly regularly. A very self-possessed young woman. Devoted to her mother, I understand. The situation there has been rather difficult. Her mother's health? Yes, and the financial pressures that attend such things. I believe Dr. Haydock has been attending Mrs. Lorimer Senior for some time." He hesitated. "Tessa has worked very hard to manage it all. I think Gerald Prescott has been accommodating in terms of her hours. She speaks well of the position." "I'm sure she does," said Miss Marple warmly. "It is so important to feel secure in one's employment." She left the vicarage 20 minutes later with 3 new entries in her notepad. Harlow Will, recently revised. Pethwick, personal property made specific. She seemed settled. Resolution of something. Lorimer, mother ill, Dr. Haydock attending, financial pressure confirmed, hours flexible. Accommodating, Clement's word. What is the accommodation precisely? The accommodation, as it turned out, was both simpler and more troubling than Miss Marple had supposed. She learned it from Miss Bartlett, not to be confused with Mrs. Bartlett of the Chrysanthemums, who was the church organist, the keeper of a great deal of village information, and the owner of a small dog that required walking past the pharmacy on Willow Dip Lane at least twice daily and occasionally more. Miss Bartlett had what Miss Marple privately described as the invaluable quality of observing without understanding. She collected details the way certain people collected stamps, for their own sake and without particular analysis, which meant that what she reported was almost always accurate. They met by arrangement and apparent coincidence at the corner of the High Street at 12:30. "Such a terrible thing about Mrs. Harlow," Miss Bartlett began, as Miss Marple had known she would. Gerald Prescott must be feeling dreadful. She was one of his most reliable customers." "I imagine so. He seemed rather shaken yesterday." Miss Marple adjusted her scarf. "I noticed Miss Lorimer wasn't in when I called. He mentioned she works Thursdays. Is that right? I thought I'd seen her there on other days." "Oh, she's there more than Thursdays now," Miss Bartlett said, with the mild authority of one reporting established fact. "She's been doing extra hours since September, Tuesdays and Thursdays, and sometimes Saturday mornings. Gerald has her doing the dispensing records now as well, not just the counter. I know because she told Mrs. Perks she'd been trained on the backroom procedures over the summer." Miss Marple absorbed this with perfect serenity. "How industrious of her." "Well, she needs the money." "Oh, poor thing." Miss Bartlett lowered her voice with practised solemnity. "Her mother's medications alone, and the nursing visits twice a week. I don't know how she manages. Gerald really has been very good to her." "He has indeed," said Miss Marple. "Backroom procedures. The dispensing records. A girl trained, over the summer specifically, in the management of the poison register and the contents of the locked room at the back of Prescott and Son, dispensing chemists, established 1887. Miss Marple walked home with this information arranged in her mind as she arranged the skeins of wool in her basket, by weight, by colour, by how they would lie when worked together. A girl with access to the dispensing room. A girl with financial desperation sufficient to keep her awake at night. A girl who came in on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and had access, and therefore to the Tuesday morning routines of a very regular, very predictable woman who collected her nerve tonic on a fixed schedule. But here Miss Marple stopped herself, as she always stopped herself at this precise point in any inquiry. Access was not guilt. Motive was not action. And in her long experience of human nature, which had never in her estimation taken a single holiday, she had learned that the most obvious vessel for suspicion was not always the one that held it. Sometimes the vessel was placed there deliberately, sometimes it was placed there by someone who understood exactly how a village thinks, and exactly how quickly a frightened young woman, with debts and a sick mother would be looked at when something went wrong. She sat down in her kitchen with her notepad and wrote one careful sentence beneath all the others. Before I look harder at Tessa Lorimer, I must look very carefully at who benefits from my looking at her. She underlined it twice. Then she put the kettle on, because it was nearly 1 o'clock, and because clear thinking, in Miss Marple's firm opinion, was very considerably assisted by a proper cup of tea. Chapter 5. The Solicitor's Amendment. Mr. Oliver Pethwick had been the village solicitor of St. Mary Mead for 27 years, and in that time he had acquired the particular quality that attaches itself to certain professionals in small communities, not quite authority, not quite familiarity, but something residing precisely between the two, like a well-worn threshold that everyone crosses without thinking about the where. He knew who owned what, who owed whom, who had revised their will in a moment of temper, and who had done so in a moment of genuine resolution. He kept all of this knowledge in the same way he kept his files, in perfect order, behind a closed door, accessible only to those with legitimate cause. Miss Marple had been constructing her legitimate cause since the previous evening. It arrived, as the best legitimate causes do, in the form of an entirely genuine concern. Miss Marple's own will, a document of no great complexity, distributing a modest estate among a small number of carefully considered recipients, had not been reviewed in 4 years. This was, by any reasonable standard, a period sufficiently long to warrant a professional consultation. She telephoned Mr. Pethwick's office at 9 o'clock on Friday morning and made an appointment for 11, explaining to his clerk, a meticulous young woman named Sandra, who wore her hair in a very tight bun and appeared to have been born at the age of 45, that she wished to review certain provisions regarding her personal property. The appointment was made, the legitimate cause was established. Miss Marple put on her good coat. Mr. Pethwick's office occupied the ground floor of a Georgian building on the north side of the High Street, separated from the pharmacy by 4 shop fronts and a considerable difference in atmosphere. Where Prescott's had warmth and the faint medicinal sweetness of a well-run dispensary, Pethwick's had the cool, deliberate stillness of a place where words were chosen with great care, and nothing was said that was not meant to be permanent. The reception room smelled of beeswax polish and old paper, and the curtains, Miss Marple noted as she had noted the asymmetry of them from outside on Thursday morning, were now drawn evenly. Someone had corrected them. This struck her as interesting, though she filed it quietly and turned her attention to Sandra, who showed her into Mr. Pethwick's inner office, with the brisk efficiency of someone who has performed this particular task approximately 6,000 times, and finds it no less satisfying for the repetition. Mr. Pethwick rose when she entered, which she approved of, and gestured her to the chair opposite his desk with a courtesy that was genuine rather than performed. He was a compact, silver-haired man of 60, with the careful eyes of someone who had spent 3 decades reading documents in which the smallest word carried the largest consequences. Miss Marple, it's been some time. Indeed it has, Mr. Pethwick. I hope you'll forgive me for not attending to this sooner. One does put these things off. One does, he agreed pleasantly, settling himself and opening a thin folder on his desk. I have your current will here. Shall we go through it together? They went through it together. Miss Marple was thorough and unhurried, asking sensible questions about inheritance provisions and the proper description of certain items of personal property. A writing desk, a small collection of watercolours, a rather good set of silver-backed hairbrushes that had been her mother's. Mr. Pethwick made notes. Sandra appeared once with coffee and disappeared again as efficiently as she had come. At the point where most people would have concluded the meeting, Miss Marple set down her coffee cup and said with perfect tranquillity, "I was so sorry to hear about Mrs. Harlow. I believe she was a client of yours?" The smallest pause. She was, yes, a great many years. I had heard she had recently made some revisions. I don't ask out of any curiosity about the specifics, only because I had been thinking about doing the same myself, regarding personal property, and I wondered whether it was the sort of thing one could do as a simple amendment, or whether it required an entirely new document. Mr. Pethwick's expression remained professionally composed, but Miss Marple, who had been watching human faces for a very long time, observed a particular quality of stillness in it that was not quite the same as ease. "It depends entirely on the nature of the change," he said. "In Mrs. Harlow's case, and I say only what I can say in general professional terms, it was a relatively modest amendment, the kind that requires a codicil rather than a new instrument, I see. And was it a recent change? I had the impression it was done within the last several months. This spring, yes. He glanced at the folder. April, I believe. April. Miss Marple added this to her internal ledger with the precision of a woman who had always been rather good at arithmetic. It must be a delicate business, she said thoughtfully, when a client revises their will in favour of, or away from, someone they see regularly, particularly in a village of this size. Mr. Pethwick looked at her steadily. Miss Marple, I wonder if I might ask what specifically you're inquiring about. It was not an aggressive question. It was the question of a careful man who had just recognised that the conversation he was having was not the conversation he had been told he was having. Miss Marple appreciated the directness. I am inquiring, she said with equal directness, about whether Mrs. Harlow changed her will in April in order to remove someone from it, or to add someone, and whether that someone might have had reason to know about the change. A silence that had considerable weight to it. Mr. Pethwick placed both hands flat on his desk in the manner of a man deciding something. I cannot tell you the contents of a client's will during the period before probate is granted, he said carefully. That is an absolute professional constraint, and I will not transgress it. He paused. What I can tell you, in the most general terms, is that when a client of long standing makes an unexpected amendment, particularly one that reduces a previously substantial provision, it is not unusual for certain parties to become aware of the fact. Wills, even confidential ones, have a way of being discussed. Discussed, Miss Marple repeated. By whom, in Mrs. Harlow's case? Another pause. Longer this time. She came in with someone, in April, to sign the codicil. That is not unusual. One requires a witness who is not a beneficiary. And the witness was... Mr. Pethwick's careful eyes held hers for a moment. A professional acquaintance of Mrs. Harlow's, someone she trusted in a capacity related to her health. Miss Marple felt the particular sensation she always felt at the moment when the threads of a tangle first begin to show their true direction. Not excitement, precisely, but a deep and very quiet certainty, like the click of a well-made lock. Someone, she said gently, from the pharmacy. Mr. Pethwick did not confirm this. He did not need to. He simply looked at his desk and said, I think, Miss Marple, that if you have genuine concerns about the circumstances of Mrs. Harlow's death, you might consider speaking with Dr. Haydock in some urgency. I understand that the coroner's office has been asked to delay its final determination. Dr. Haydock has been very helpful, Miss Marple said. She rose, gathered her bag and gloves, and offered her hand. Thank you, Mr. Pethwick. You have been more illuminating than you perhaps intended to be. I intended to be precisely as illuminating as I was, he said quietly. No more, no less. She believed him. He was, she thought, a good man in a difficult position, a man who knew something was wrong and was doing what he could within the considerable constraints of his profession. She respected that. Outside on the high street the mist had lifted at last, and a thin autumn sun was making a determined effort over the elm trees. Miss Marple stood for a moment on the pavement and looked toward the pharmacy at the far end of the street, its green-painted door very still and closed. Someone from the pharmacy witnessed the will in April, someone who thereby knew that a substantial provision had been reduced, someone who understood that the person who'd been removed from that will, or diminished in it, had a motive that had just become considerably more urgent. She opened her notepad. The witness to the codicil knew. The witness is the key. The witness is either the killer or the killer's protection. Find the witness. Everything else follows. She closed the notepad, put it in her pocket, and walked with her usual unhurried step toward Dr. Haydock's surgery. There was no time, she thought. For the long way round. The coroner's determination would not wait indefinitely, and once it was filed, the lock would be set and the truth buried quietly beneath a marble slab engraved with the words, natural causes, which were, in Miss Marple's considerable experience, among the most dangerous words in the English language. Chapter 6. The Bitter Almond. Dr. Haydock's surgery occupied a solid Victorian house at the quieter end of the high street, set back from the pavement behind a low wall of Cotswold stone, and a garden that was, at this time of year, doing its conscientious best with late salvias and a rather magnificent copper beech that turned the whole front of the house a deep and melancholy amber in October. Miss Marple had always thought it the most honest-looking building in St Mary Mead, not pretty exactly, but entirely without pretension, which she considered a far more reliable quality. Dr. Haydock was not with a patient when she arrived. His receptionist, a broad, competent woman named Mrs. Gill, who had held the position for 15 years and treated all visitors to the surgery with the same expression of calm, professional suspicion, showed Miss Marple into the consulting room without appointment, which spoke well of the understanding between them. Haydock was at his desk, writing. He looked up, set down his pen, and said, "I've been expecting you since yesterday." "Then I haven't kept you waiting too long," Miss Marple said, sitting down. "What have you heard from the coroner?" "The determination has been suspended pending a toxicological examination. It took some persuasion, and Inspector Slack is not pleased." Haydock leaned back in his chair with the expression of a man who has weathered Slack's displeasure many times before and found it consistently survivable. "The examination will take 4 to 6 days. Which means we have, at most, 4 to 6 days before this is either confirmed as murder or closed as natural causes and sealed permanently." "Then I shall have to be efficient," Miss Marple said. "Robert, I need to ask you something that requires you to speak to me as a colleague rather than a physician bound by protocol." Haydock looked at her. "I shall do my best." "The digitalis tonic that Mrs. Harlow was prescribed, what was the standard dispensed dose?" 20 drops in water, twice daily, a relatively conservative preparation, appropriate for her condition and well within safe parameters at that dosage. "And at what concentration would the same compound become dangerous? Specifically, lethal, in a woman of her age and existing cardiac vulnerability?" Haydock was quiet for a moment. If the preparation had been made at 3 to 4 times the standard concentration, which would not materially alter its appearance, its colour or its taste, a single standard dose of 20 drops could produce toxic serum levels within 40 minutes to an hour. In someone with a pre-existing arrhythmia, he stopped. It would look precisely like what it looked like. And could such an alteration be made to an existing bottle, one already dispensed and labelled? With access to the raw compound and a basic understanding of pharmaceutical preparation, yes, easily. You would decant a portion, replace it with a concentrated solution, mix it adequately and reseal it. He picked up his pen and set it down again. It would require perhaps 10 minutes. It would require privacy. And it would require knowing precisely which bottle to alter. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Which means it would require knowing the dispensing record, the specific bottle number, the date it was filled, where it was stored. Yes. And access to the back room. Yes. She sat with this for a moment, turning it as she turned a difficult knitting problem, not forcing it, but examining it from each direction with patience. Then she said, "There is something else. When Mrs. Harlow was found, was there any note made of a scent, in the room or about the body?" Haydock frowned. A scent? Bitter almond. It would have been faint, and very brief. It dissipates quickly, particularly in a closed room that has been shut for some time before discovery. Haydock was very still. "You're suggesting cyanide?" "I am suggesting," Miss Marple said carefully, "that the digitalis theory accounts for the mechanism of death entirely adequately, and that I do not wish to abandon it. But I find myself returning to a small detail that has been troubling me since Wednesday morning." She opened her notepad. "Mrs. Harlow, when she came out of the pharmacy, was carrying her bag in her right hand, unfolded with the top only pressed together, as though it had been opened and reclosed in a hurry." She looked up. "But the bottle would have been sealed. A resealed bottle, properly stoppered and wrapped, would not require the bag to be opened at all, unless something else was in the bag." "Something else," Haydock repeated slowly. "A second item, something small perhaps. Something that might be used in combination with the tonic, rather than as a replacement for it." She paused. "Is there a preparation, a powder perhaps, that could be added to a digitalis tonic and would remain undetected on examination, but would significantly accelerate cardiac failure in a vulnerable patient?" Haydock looked at her for a long moment with an expression she recognized, the expression of a man confronting the uncomfortable distance between what he suspected and what he could demonstrate. "There are compounds," he said at last. "Certain combinations of potassium salts, in sufficient concentration, administered alongside a digitalis preparation. Yes. The interaction is synergistic. The cardiac effect would be dramatically amplified, and on a standard post-mortem examination, Without a highly specific toxicological screen, the potassium levels would be ambiguous. The body produces potassium irregularities naturally in the process of cardiac failure. It would be extremely difficult to distinguish a natural elevation from an administered one, but not impossible. With the right specialist and the right screen, no, not impossible. Miss Marple closed her notepad with a small, definitive click. Then that, she said, is what we must ask the toxicologist to look for, not merely digitalis concentration, potassium levels, and anything else that might have been in a second small packet, the kind that might be sold across a pharmacy counter as a perfectly ordinary preparation. Haydock reached immediately for his telephone. While Haydock made his call, Miss Marple sat quietly in the consulting room and looked out the window at the copper beech in the garden, its amber leaves shifting in a thin wind that had come up from the east since morning. She was thinking about the open side door and the unfolded bag, and the pasted page in the poison register, and the codicil signed in April, and the witness whose name she did not yet know, but whose shape she was beginning to see very clearly indeed. The shape of someone who had stood very close to Mrs. Harlow for a long time, in the particular way that proximity becomes invisible. The best place to hide, Miss Marple had always believed, was not in the shadows. It was in the light, in the routine, in the familiar figure that the eye passes over because it has always been there. She thought about Gerald Prescott, his unsteady hands, his overcompensated smoothness, his eyes moving toward the dispensing hatch. A frightened man, certainly. But was he frightened because he had done something, or because he knew what had been done, and had not yet decided what to do about knowing it? There was a difference. In Miss Marple's experience, it was one of the most important differences in the world. And she thought about Tessa Lorimer, trained in backroom procedures over the summer, trusted with the dispensing records, financially desperate in the specific and grinding way that does not announce itself, but simply tightens, week by week, like a thread pulled too slowly to snap all at once. A young woman doing everything correctly, everything properly, smiling at customers and managing the register and carrying home, at the end of each long Tuesday and Thursday, a wage that was not quite sufficient and a conscience that was, Miss Marple hoped, still intact. But Tessa Lorimer had not been in the pharmacy on Tuesday morning. Gerald had said so. Gerald, who was frightened. And yet the side door had been open at 23 minutes past 8. Haydock replaced the receiver. The toxicologist will extend the screen. I've explained what to look for. He sat down heavily. Jane, if you're right, this was not an impulsive act. This was planned. Carefully, specifically planned by someone with pharmaceutical knowledge, access to the dispensing room, and an intimate understanding of Mrs. Harlow's routine. Yes, Miss Marple said, that is what concerns me most. The planning? No. She looked at him with her mild, steady eyes. The intimacy? This was done by someone Mrs. Harlow trusted completely. Someone whose presence in her routine was so ordinary, so expected, that she never once thought to question it. She paused. That is not the crime of a desperate person acting in a moment of fear. That is the crime of a person who made a decision, perhaps weeks ago, perhaps longer, and then simply waited for the right morning. She rose, collected her gloves and bag, and paused at the door. The bitter almond, she said, as though to herself. Cyanide. I mentioned it, and you heard the word. But I was thinking of something rather more particular, she turned. In St. Mary Mead, Robert, there is a variety of rose called the Old Blush. It has a very faint almond scent in autumn. Mrs. Harlow grew 3 of them against her back wall. I noticed them on my second visit, and I noticed that someone had recently cut them back, not tidily, not the way Mrs. Harlow would have done it, but quickly, as though they needed something from the stems rather than merely wished to prune them. She put on her gloves with care. I may be wrong about the cyanide. I probably am. But I'm not wrong that someone has been in Mrs. Harlow's garden since her death, and that is a detail I intend to look into this afternoon. Haydock stared at her. Jane, if someone has already been back to the scene? Then they are not finished, Miss Marple said simply. And neither am I. She walked out into the thin October sun, her step unhurried, and her mind moving at considerable speed. Chapter 7. The Garden at Pump Street. Mrs. Harlow's cottage sat at the quieter end of Pump Street, separated from its neighbour on the left by a low privet hedge, and from the lane behind it by a wooden gate that had been painted green so many times it had lost all memory of its original grain. It was a small contained house, 2 up, 2 down, with a scullery added at the back sometime in the 30s, and it had the particular quality of a home that had been lived in by one person for a very long time, gradually becoming less a house and more a precise expression of a single, careful life. The front garden was put to bed for autumn with the methodical neatness Miss Marple had expected. Dahlias lifted and stored, the rose stems pegged back, the edging of the small lawn trimmed with ruler-like exactness. Mrs. Harlow had loved her garden the way she had loved everything, reliably, quietly, and without any unnecessary fuss, which made the state of the back garden considerably more interesting. Miss Marple did not go directly to the back garden. She went first to Mrs. Ida Cope next door, who had found Mrs. Harlow and who was, by the Friday afternoon of the week in question, in the precise emotional condition that Miss Marple required, distressed enough to talk freely, composed enough to talk coherently, and deeply, genuinely grateful that someone was taking the matter seriously, rather than patting her hand and suggesting she make a cup of tea. Mrs. Cope was 58, a widow with strong opinions about draughts, and she had the excellent quality of a natural observer living in close proximity to her subject. She had shared a privet hedge with Mrs. Harlow for 11 years. "I keep thinking I should have gone sooner," Mrs. Cope said, for what Miss Marple understood was not the first time that week. They were sitting in Mrs. Cope's kitchen, which smelled of warm bread, and the particular sadness of a house in which someone is being very brave. "I heard her come in. I always heard her come in. The front door has a very distinctive click, and then nothing. Usually she'd have the wireless on by 9:30, when it got to 10:15 and still nothing. You were quite right to go when you did," Miss Marple said firmly. "You could not have done anything sooner, and I want you to be quite certain of that." She paused. "Mrs. Cope, did you notice anyone in the lane behind the cottages at any point on Tuesday morning? Or since then?" Perhaps," Mrs. Cope frowned. "The lane? Behind?" She considered this seriously, which Miss Marple appreciated. "Tuesday morning I was at the front mostly, but I did go out to the dustbin at the back. That would have been around 9, I think, perhaps a little after." She paused. "There was someone in the lane. I didn't think anything of it at the time. It's a public lane, people do walk through. Can you describe them? Dark coat, not a long one, a mackintosh more like, and they were walking quickly away from me so I didn't see the face." She paused again, more carefully this time. "They had something under their arm. A bag of some kind. Not a shopping bag. More like a satchel or a large envelope. Flat." Miss Marple wrote this down. A flat bag. Large enough to carry documents, or a ledger page, or a sheet of paper folded once. Was there anything else? Anything about the way they walked or their height? "Slim," Mrs. Cope said. "Youngish, I thought, though I couldn't say why exactly. The way they moved." She looked at Miss Marple directly. "Do you think it matters?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that it may matter a great deal." The green gate at the bottom of Mrs. Harlow's back garden was unlocked, which was the first notable detail, since Mrs. Cope confirmed that Mrs. Harlow had kept it latched without exception, and it swung on hinges that had recently been oiled. Recently enough that Miss Marple could still detect the faint mineral smell of the oil when she bent, as though to examine the latch, at an angle that her knees did not entirely endorse. She straightened, took a breath, and looked at the garden. It was, as the front garden was not, slightly disordered, not dramatically, not in the way of obvious intrusion or damage, but in the specific telling way of a place in which someone has moved through it with purpose and some haste, attending to particular things without attending to the whole. The old blush roses grew against the back wall, 3 of them, exactly as she had observed on her previous visit. They were a soft, faded pink at the end of their season. Small, clustered flowers with that distinctive faint scent, sweeter than most modern varieties, and with that particular quality that had made her think of bitter almond. Not because the scent was almond precisely, but because both possessed a sweetness that carried an undertone of something sharper, of something chemical. She examined the roses with the methodical attention she gave to anything that had asked to be looked at twice. 2 of the 3 plants were as she would have expected, their end-of-season growth straggly and unpruned, their hips beginning to form. The 3rd had been cut back. Not pruned. She had been right about that when she had told Haydock. The cuts were too blunt, made with something less precise than proper secateurs, and they were selective. Not the deadwood, not the crossing branches, but specific green stems taken at a length of approximately 8 to 10 inches. Not pruning, harvesting. Miss Marple stood very still and thought about old blush roses and what, specifically, their green stems contained in any quantity worth harvesting in autumn when the plant was moving its energy downward. She thought about the chemistry of plant compounds, a subject she had read about with some thoroughness in a volume borrowed from Dr. Haydock 3 years ago, during a previous unpleasantness that had involved a garden in rather the same way. Then she walked, with deliberate calm, to the small garden shed in the far left corner of the plot. The shed lock was a simple padlock of the kind sold at any ironmonger's. It was closed, but the hasp from which it hung had been recently moved. She could see the fresh bright marks in the old painted wood where the screws had been removed and replaced, not quite perfectly aligned. The lock, in other words, was purely theatrical. Someone had detached it, accessed the shed, and reattached it, relying on the reasonable assumption that nobody would look closely at a dead woman's garden shed within 4 days of her death. This, Miss Marple reflected, was the particular error of people who were intelligent enough to plan carefully, but not experienced enough to understand that careful planning has a specific flaw. It assumes that no one is looking for exactly what has been hidden. She did not open the shed. She was not, in any official capacity, entitled to open it, and she had learned long ago that evidence improperly obtained has a way of becoming evidence that cannot be used. Instead, she took out her notepad and wrote the location, the condition of the hasp, the fresh screw marks, and the size and angle of the marks in precise and usable detail. Then she stood back and looked at the whole garden, the gate, the roses, the shed, and she thought about the slim figure in the dark mackintosh with the flat bag under one arm, walking quickly away from Mrs. Cope at 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning. Not Gerald Prescott. Gerald was broad-shouldered and moved with the particular deliberateness of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible in a life that had never quite been his own. The figure Mrs. Cope described was slim, young, quick, but also, and here was where Miss Marple paused and looked again at the rose stems and revised a calculation she had been quietly constructing since Wednesday. Also someone who had known about the old blush roses, someone who had been to this garden before, someone who knew where the shed key was kept and had time enough before 9 in the morning to oil a gate latch, cut specific stems, and remove something from a shed, and still, if Miss Lorimer was the figure in question, reach the pharmacy by the time the front door opened at 8:30. Unless the pharmacy visit had come first. Unless the order of events on Tuesday morning was not what Miss Marple had been assuming. She walked to the gate and through it, and latched it behind her. She stood in the lane and looked both ways along its length, empty now in the thin afternoon light, the backs of the cottage gardens on each side with their orderly domesticity, their compost heaps and their cold frames and their absolute indifference to the human drama that had passed through them 4 days ago. The lane ran north to the High Street. From the High Street one could reach the pharmacy's side door without being seen from the front of the building. The side door that had been open at 23 minutes past 8. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves and turned north. She needed to speak to Constable Ferry, not Inspector Slack. Slack would dismiss everything she said and then, 3 days later, repeat it back as his own deduction with the unshakable confidence of a man who has never doubted himself for a moment. But Ferry was sensible, and Ferry had the authority to secure a garden shed, and Ferry would listen. The question that walked with Miss Marple all the way up the lane and onto the High Street was not who had been in the garden. She was becoming fairly certain about that. The question was why the garden visit had been necessary at all. What had been left there that needed removing, and what, once removed, had been done with it. Because whatever had been in that shed, it was no longer there. And whatever had been carried away in a flat bag on Tuesday morning was somewhere in St. Mary Mead right now. Chapter 8. The Constable and the Register. Constable Doris Ferry had joined the St. Mary Mead Constabulary 4 years ago at the age of 26, transferred from a busier posting in Maidstone that had left her with a practical, unsentimental approach to human behaviour and a very healthy respect for the difference between what people said and what people did. She was a tall, composed young woman with a direct manner that Inspector Slack periodically mistook for insubordination, and that Miss Marple recognised immediately as simple competence, the kind that does not require approval in order to function. They had spoken twice before in a professional context, On both occasions, Constable Ferry had listened to everything Miss Marple said, asked 2 or 3 precise questions, and then acted on the information without attribution, which Miss Marple considered the highest form of professional courtesy available to her in the circumstances. She found Ferry at the police house on Back Lane at 3:30, writing up her notes from the morning at a desk that was considerably tidier than Slack's, with a cup of tea that had not yet gone cold. Miss Marple approved of both details. Miss Marple? Ferry set down her pen with the decisiveness of someone who's been waiting for a particular interruption. I wondered when you'd come. I hope I haven't kept you waiting too long, Miss Marple said, sitting down. Inspector Slack has formally recorded Mrs. Harlowe's death as pending the toxicological examination, Ferry said, which was not quite an answer, but was more useful than one. He is not treating the premises as a crime scene. He made that determination yesterday afternoon, which means Mrs. Harlowe's cottage and garden are currently unsecured. Technically, yes, the key is held at this office, and Mrs. Cope has been asked not to enter, but there is no officer posted. Ferry's expression was entirely neutral. Should there be? Miss Marple placed her notepad on the desk and turned it to face Ferry, who read the entries with the focused attention of someone following a map. She read without interruption, which Miss Marple found deeply refreshing after a week of being interrupted by people who felt that their misunderstanding of a situation entitled them to speak before it had been fully explained. When Ferry finished, she looked up. The shed hasp. Yes, the important point is not what was taken. I don't know yet what was stored there. The important point is that someone returned to that garden on Tuesday morning before the body was discovered, which means they returned while Mrs. Harlowe was already dead or dying inside the cottage. They knew she was dead, or they were certain enough that she would be dead not to be concerned about being seen by her. That's premeditation, Ferry said quietly, of a very specific kind. Not merely the act itself, but the management of its aftermath. This person had a removal plan. They had oiled the gate, not recently I think, but perhaps over the past several weeks, in small increments, so that it would not suddenly be different on the day it was needed. They knew about the shed. They knew about the roses. Miss Marple paused. Constable Ferry, I need 2 things. I need that shed secured before another 24 hours passes, which I think you can arrange without Inspector Slack's direct involvement if it is framed as routine security of an unoccupied premises, and I need to know whether it is possible to examine the poison register at Prescott's without Gerald Prescott being aware that it is being examined. Ferry considered both requests with the same level expression. The shed, yes. I can arrange a welfare check on the property and secure it under standard unoccupied premises protocol. Slack won't question that, she paused. The register is more complicated. It's a legally held record on private business premises. I cannot remove it or examine it without either a warrant, which requires Slack's authorization, which he won't give without cause, or the voluntary cooperation of the proprietor. And if the proprietor is involved, then voluntary cooperation is unlikely. Ferry picked up her pen and set it down again. Unless there is a second person with legal authority over the premises. Miss Marple was very still for a moment. Arthur Prescott's will, she said slowly. Gerald inherited the business. But is there a co-executor, a trustee of the original estate? Ferry looked at her with the expression of someone who has just watched a key turn in a lock. I don't know, but I can find out this afternoon. Mr. Pethwick would know, Miss Marple said. And I believe Mr. Pethwick is in a mood to be cooperative. The afternoon moved with the particular efficiency that results when 2 organised women are working toward the same end without requiring each other to explain themselves at length. Ferry went to Pethwick's office. Miss Marple went home, made tea, and sat at her writing desk to compose what she thought of as her summary of threads. The full sequence of observations laid out in order, not as a narrative but as a structure, the way one lays out the pieces of a garment before beginning to sew, to be certain that nothing is missing and that everything will, when assembled, produce the correct shape. She wrote for 40 minutes without stopping. When she had finished, she read it through once, made 2 small corrections, and then read it through again with the particular attention she gave to things she had committed to paper. Because writing a thing down, Miss Marple had always found, had a way of showing you what you actually believed, as opposed to what you merely suspected. What she actually believed, laid out in sequence, was this. Someone with access to the dispensing room at Prescott's had altered Mrs. Harlowe's tonic. either by increasing the concentration of the digitalis preparation itself or by adding a second compound designed to amplify its cardiac effect. This had been done recently, within the last 2 dispensing cycles, she thought, given the timing, and required knowledge of pharmaceutical preparation beyond the counter level. It required, in other words, dispensing training. The same person had attended Mrs. Harlow in some trusted capacity, trusted enough to have been in her garden on multiple prior occasions, to know the location of the shed key, to have gradually prepared the gate latch over several weeks. Trusted enough that Mrs. Harlow had brought them to Mr. Pethwick's office in April as a witness to her codicil, which meant she'd considered them a person of sufficient respectability and impartiality to perform a legal function. The codicil, and this was where Miss Marple's pen had paused longest, had reduced a previously substantial provision. Someone had been removed from or diminished in Mrs. Harlow's will. That person had been present when the change was formalised. They had watched Mrs. Harlow sign her own revised intentions and had signed their own name beneath it as witness, and had then had 6 months to consider what those revised intentions meant for them personally. 6 months! Which was approximately how long Miss Lorimer had been performing dispensing duties. Miss Marple put down her pen. She picked up her knitting. The trouble, the very specific trouble that had been sitting at the edge of her certainty since Chapter 4 of this particular inquiry, as she privately thought of it, was Miss Lorimer herself. Because when Miss Marple arranged everything she knew about Tessa Lorimer and held it against what she knew about the kind of person who commits this particular kind of crime, something did not quite fit. It was not the motive. The motive was entirely coherent. It was not the access. She had that. It was not even the capacity. Because Miss Lorimer was clearly intelligent and had been given more than enough training to understand pharmaceutical compounds. It was the witnessing of the will. A person of intelligence planning a crime would not witness a document that directly connected them to the financial motive for that crime. It was too direct, too visible. It was the sort of error that was either catastrophically careless or deliberately constructed. And Tessa Lorimer, in Miss Marple's observation, was not careless, which left the second possibility, which was that the witnessing of the will had not been an error, that it had been arranged deliberately, arranged by someone else, someone who had ensured that Tessa Lorimer's name was on that document, who had suggested to Mrs. Harlow that she bring the young woman along, who had understood that a frightened girl with debts and a sick mother was a very convenient figure to have standing close to a crime when it was eventually noticed. Miss Marple's needles stopped. She thought of Gerald Prescott's eyes moving toward the dispensing hatch. Not guilt. Not the movement of a guilty man looking toward the place where he had done something wrong. The movement of a frightened man looking toward the place where he had done something he had not fully understood until it was too late to undo. The movement, she now thought, of a man who'd been told that it was all arranged, that nothing would go wrong, that the girl would be the one who was seen, and who was now, in the aftermath, beginning to understand exactly what kind of arrangement he had agreed to. A knock at the door interrupted her. It was Constable Ferry, slightly out of breath from walking quickly, with a small notebook open in her hand and an expression that Miss Marple had not seen on her face before, something between professional composure and controlled urgency. "Arthur Prescott's estate," Ferry said, stepping inside. "Gerald is sole heir to the business, but the original pharmacy license, the dispensing license for controlled substances, was issued jointly to Gerald Prescott and to Arthur Prescott's co-partner, who retired in 1948. She looked at her notebook. The co-partner retained a legal interest in the license that was never formally dissolved. Under the terms of the original partnership deed, they retained the right to inspect all dispensing records at any time without prior notice to the operating partner. Miss Marple set down her knitting. "And who is the co-partner?" Ferry looked up. "A Mr. Raymond Lorimer, Tessa Lorimer's grandfather." The room was very quiet for a moment. "He's 81, Ferry continued. "He lives in sheltered accommodation in Haslemere. But the legal interest is current, and his granddaughter, as his named personal representative in matters of health and mobility," she paused, "has held his power of attorney since last January." Miss Marple looked at her for a long moment. "Then Tessa Lorimer," she said softly, "has had the legal right to inspect that register from the beginning." "Yes," said Ferry, "and so has anyone acting on her behalf." "Or," Miss Marple said, "anyone who knew she had that right, and knew that she did not yet know it herself." She stood up. with the decisive energy of someone who has just seen the last piece of a pattern declare itself with absolute clarity. "Constable Ferry," she said, "I think we need to speak to Tessa Lorimer tonight, before someone else does." Chapter 9. The Confession at Willow Dip Lane. The evening had come down over St. Mary Mead with the swift, definitive quality of October evenings, not gradual, not apologetic, but simply present, as though the dark had been waiting just beyond the elm trees all day and had finally been given permission to proceed. By 5:30, the high street was quiet, the pharmacy dark behind its green door, the solicitor's office closed and curtained. The village had folded itself up for the night with the comfortable self-satisfaction of a place that considered its own routines to be, in all essential respects, correct. Miss Marple and Constable Ferry walked to Willow Dip Lane in silence, which suited them both. Miss Marple had, on the walk from her cottage, composed in her mind the shape of the conversation that needed to happen. Not a confrontation. She had never found confrontation useful, and it had a particular tendency to harden people into positions from which they could not then be moved without considerable damage to everyone involved. What was needed was something closer to an unlocking. The right question put in the right tone at the right moment, in the way that a carefully chosen key does not force a lock, but simply allows it to do what it was always capable of doing. Tessa Lorimer, Miss Marple had concluded, was not the architect of this crime. She was its most carefully prepared structural element, placed precisely, weight-bearing, designed to collapse inward if the whole construction was ever examined. Whether she knew she had been so placed was the question that would determine everything. The light was on in the upper window of the terraced house on Willow Dip Lane. Ferry knocked with the particular knock of someone who is police but does not wish to sound alarming about it. 3 measured taps, nothing urgent. Tessa Lorimer opened the door in her work clothes, a cardigan pulled over her pharmacy uniform, her dark hair somewhat untidy in the way of someone who has had a long and difficult week, and is managing it largely through the suppression of everything that might otherwise cause it to show. She was younger looking than Miss Marple had expected, not in years, which were 26 as advertised, but in the particular quality of her face, which had not yet fully learned to conceal what it felt, though it was clearly working on it. She looked at Ferry and at Miss Marple, and her expression went through 3 things in rapid succession: surprise, recognition, and something that was not quite fear but was in the same neighbourhood. "Miss Marple," she said, "and Constable Ferry." "Miss Lorimer," Ferry said, "may we come in? We'd like to speak with you about Mrs. Harlow, if that's all right." A pause, then, "Yes, of course." The sitting room upstairs was small and kept with the same effortful neatness as the street outside. Everything clean, everything in its place, the kind of order that is maintained not from abundance but from the particular discipline of someone who cannot afford disorder in any department. A medical textbook was open on the table beside the sofa. A second-hand pharmacology reference sat beneath it. On the mantelpiece, a photograph of an older woman in a garden, Mrs. Lorimer Senior, Miss Marple supposed, in better health, and beside it, a small framed certificate in Tessa's name from the Pharmaceutical Society. Tessa sat in the chair by the window. Ferry and Miss Marple took the sofa. Nobody offered tea, which told Miss Marple that the girl already knew or strongly suspected that this was not that kind of visit. "I want to say something before you ask me anything," Tessa said. Her voice was steady with the specific steadiness of someone who has been rehearsing this moment for several days. "I know how it looks. I know what I look like in this. And I need you to know that I did not give Mrs. Harlow anything that would harm her. I would never." She stopped, pressed her hands together in her lap. "I'm sorry. Please ask your questions," Miss Marple said, very gently. "When did you first understand that your grandfather held a legal interest in the dispensing licence at Prescott's?" Tessa blinked. This was clearly not the question she had been expecting. Last week. Wednesday. Gerald told me." "Gerald told you," Miss Marple repeated. "The day after Mrs. Harlow died." "Yes." Something moved in Tessa's expression. A shift, subtle but real. The way a surface changes when a weight that has been pressing it from below is suddenly identified. "He came to me at the pharmacy in the afternoon, after Inspector Slack had been and gone, and he said there was something I needed to know, that my grandfather had a legal interest that I'd inherited through the power of attorney, that it gave me the right to inspect the register." She paused. "He said he was telling me in case anyone came asking questions, in case I needed to know my own legal position. In case, Miss Marple said, you needed to know that you had a reason, a documented, legal reason, to have accessed the dispensing records. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Tessa's face changed completely. Not dramatically, she was not a dramatic person, but in the small, irreversible way of someone who has just understood something they cannot then ununderstand. The colour went out of her slowly, like milk spreading in water. She stopped, started again. He was giving me an alibi. He was giving you a framework, Miss Marple said carefully, within which your access to the records would appear legitimate, which suggests that he anticipated the records being examined. She paused. And that he anticipated your name being connected to them. He knew, Tessa said, very quietly. He already knew what was in the register. I think, Miss Marple said, that he knew rather more than that. Miss Lorimer, I want to ask you about the codicil, Mrs. Harlowe's amended will signed in April. Were you present when she signed it? Tessa looked at her hands. Gerald asked me to go with her. He said she was nervous about going to a solicitor alone, and that she'd asked if someone from the pharmacy could come along as a familiar face. He said it was a kindness. A pause. I signed as a witness. I didn't read the document. I didn't know what was being changed. Did Gerald go with you? No, he said he had an appointment he couldn't move. And did Mrs. Harlowe seem nervous? Tessa thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. She seemed resolved, not nervous exactly. She was very quiet on the way there and on the way back. She thanked me at the end and she said... She stopped. What did she say? She said, it needed doing, and now it's done. I thought she meant the will. Tessa's voice was very even. I thought it was just an old woman putting her affairs in order. And Gerald, Miss Marple said, what did Gerald inherit from his father's will specifically, beyond the business? Tessa was quiet for a moment. I don't know the specifics, but I know that Arthur Prescott and Mrs. Harlowe were close for many years, before she was widowed and after. Not a romance exactly by the time I knew anything about it, but a long, close friendship. The kind that... She stopped again, and when she continued her voice had changed in the way that voices change when a person is assembling something as they speak. The kind that might have been reflected in a will, in Arthur's will, before Arthur died. And after Arthur died, Miss Marple said, Mrs. Harlowe's own will, in which some provision, was reduced or removed, in April of this year. Tessa stared at her. Gerald, she said, not a question, a calculation arriving at its result. Mrs. Harlowe revised her will to reduce what had previously been a substantial provision for the Prescott family, Miss Marple said. We do not know precisely why. Perhaps a disagreement. Perhaps simply a change of feeling after Arthur's death made the connection feel differently. But she revised it. And Gerald knew, because Gerald had known about that provision for years, had perhaps counted upon it, and then watched it disappear on a Wednesday afternoon in April, with a girl from his own pharmacy sitting across the table as a witness. He put me there, Tessa said. She sounded almost calm, in the way of someone in shock. He put me there so that when it eventually came to light, I would be the one who'd been present, who had known about the change, who had the financial motive and the pharmaceutical access and the legal right to the register. She looked up. He constructed everything, the training, the extra hours, the power of attorney information. He must have known about grandfather's interest for years and never told me. Her voice was very steady. He built the entire thing around me. Yes, Miss Marple said. I believe he did. Ferry had been writing throughout this conversation with the quiet efficiency of someone who understands that the value of what is being said depends entirely on its being accurately recorded. She looked up now. Miss Lorimer, the side door of the pharmacy, Tuesday morning, before 8:30. Can you tell me where you were? Home, Tessa said immediately. I don't start until 9 on Tuesdays. I was here, getting my mother's medications ready for the morning nurse. She paused. The nurse comes at 8:30. She'd have been here. We'll need her name, Ferry said. Mrs. Patricia Dowell. She's been coming every Tuesday and Thursday for 4 months. Tessa looked at Ferry with the clear, direct gaze of someone who has nothing left to protect by being indirect. Gerald has a key to the side door. I don't. I've never had a key to the side door. The room was very quiet. Outside, a wind had come up and was moving through the elms at the end of the lane with a sound like distant water. Miss Marple rose, as she always rose at the moment when the essential had been established, and the rest was for other, more official hands, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the unhurried finality of someone closing a book that has been read to its necessary end. "Miss Lorimer," she said, "you have been very courageous this evening. I want you to know that Constable Ferry will ensure that everything you have told us is properly recorded and acted upon. I also want you to know—" She paused, and her voice held the particular warmth of someone who means precisely what they say— "that this is not your fault. Being trusted is not the same as being complicit, and being placed in a frame is not the same as belonging in one." Tessa Lorimer looked at her for a moment, and the steadiness in her face shifted, just briefly, into something more genuine and more fragile. "Thank you," she said quietly. Miss Marple nodded, collected her bag and gloves and walked to the door. Gerald Prescott, she thought, as she descended the narrow stairs to the street. Gerald, who had inherited a life rather than chosen one. Gerald, who had watched a substantial legacy disappear into a revised codicil on a Wednesday afternoon, and had spent the following 6 months building a very careful, very deliberate structure designed to ensure that someone else stood in the place he had prepared. Not an impulsive man, not a desperate one. A cold man. The coldest kind of cold. The kind that looks, in an October village, indistinguishable from mere unhappiness. She stepped out into the dark lane. She had one more conversation to have tomorrow morning. One that would require all of her considerable composure. Chapter 10. The reckoning at Prescott's Saturday morning arrived in St. Mary Mead with a clarity that felt almost deliberate, as though the weather, having provided a full week of mist and drizzle and thin uncertain light, had decided that what was about to happen deserved to be seen properly. The sky was a pale, washed blue above the elm trees. The frost on the pavement sparkled with the brief intensity of something that knows it will not last the morning. And the high street had the particular quality of early Saturday. Shopkeepers opening their doors, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery on Pump Street, the sound of the church clock marking 8 with its usual unhurried authority. Miss Marple dressed with more care than usual. Not ostentation, she was entirely without vanity in the decorative sense, but the care of someone who understands that how one presents oneself to a serious moment is itself a form of seriousness. Her good grey coat, her pale gloves, her small brooch at the collar, which had been her mother's and which she wore on occasions that required, in her private estimation, a certain moral weight. She had telephoned Constable Ferry at 7 o'clock, which Ferry had answered on the second ring, which confirmed what Miss Marple had supposed, that Ferry had not slept a great deal either. The toxicology preliminary came through this morning, Ferry said, without preamble. Elevated digitalis concentration in the tonic bottle found at Mrs. Harlowe's, 3.5 times the prescribed strength, and potassium levels in the post-mortem consistent with external administration rather than natural cardiac failure. She paused. The coroner has issued a formal homicide determination. Inspector Slack has been notified. When will Slack arrive? He said 9 o'clock. Then I have 1 hour, Miss Marple said. Miss Marple. Ferry's voice held the careful tone of someone who is about to say something that is both professionally necessary and personally reluctant. Whatever you're planning to do in that hour, I would ask that you not do it alone. I had no intention of doing it alone, Miss Marple said. I was rather hoping you might walk with me. They arrived at Prescott's at 8:20. The open sign was already in the window. Gerald was always punctual, whatever else might be said of him, and through the glass they could see the interior of the pharmacy in its familiar morning arrangement. The counter polished, the shelves in order, the amber and green of the medicine bottles catching the early light in the way that had always struck Miss Marple as one of the more quietly beautiful things in the village. Gerald Prescott was behind the counter. He looked up when they entered, and Miss Marple watched his face with the complete and compassionate attention she brought to this particular moment. The moment when a person sees what is coming and understands that it has been coming for some time, and that the distance between now and its arrival has finally been closed. It was never a pleasant thing to observe. She had observed it more times than she would have chosen to. Gerald's face did not collapse. It did not perform. It simply became, in the space of approximately 2 seconds, very still and very tired. The face of a man who has been carrying something for 6 months and has reached the point where the carrying is no longer possible. Miss Marple, he said. His voice was level. Constable Ferry. Good morning, Mr. Prescott, Miss Marple said. She approached the counter with the unhurried step she'd used all week, the step of an elderly woman running a perfectly ordinary errand, and she set her gloved hands on the counter and looked at him with an expression that was not unkind. "I think," she said quietly, "that you have been waiting for this conversation since Tuesday morning." A pause. Gerald looked at his hands, the same hands she had noted on Wednesday, still not entirely steady, though the tremor now had a different quality, not nerves, exhaustion. "The toxicology," he said. It was not a question. "Yes. The preliminary came through this morning. The coroner has issued a homicide determination. Inspector Slack will be here at 9, she paused. "You have approximately 40 minutes, Mr. Prescott, in which what you tell me and Constable Ferry will be received as a voluntary account rather than a formal interrogation. I tell you this not as a legal authority, I have none, but as a person who has found that the truth, when it eventually surfaces more completely and more usefully when it's offered rather than extracted." Gerald Prescott looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Ferry, who was standing to one side with her notebook open, and her expression entirely composed. Then he looked back at Miss Marple. "I didn't mean for her to die," he said. It was said quietly, without drama, and Miss Marple believed him, which was not the same as believing that it excused anything, but was nonetheless an important distinction. "Tell me what you did mean," she said. He exhaled very slowly, the way one exhales after carrying something heavy over a long distance. "The legacy. Mrs. Harlow had told my father, years ago, before he died, that she intended to leave the pharmacy a substantial sum. Enough to modernize the dispensing room, to replace the equipment, to make it viable for another generation." He paused. "When father died and I took over, she confirmed it to me directly. £120 at minimum, possibly more. It was the difference between the business surviving and not. I had debts, equipment failures, the margins on dispensing were tightening every year. And then she changed her will," Miss Marple said. "In April, she told me herself the week before. She said she had been reconsidering her priorities, that she felt the legacy should go somewhere. More personal. She was very kind about it. Very composed." Something moved in his face. She had no idea what it meant. For the business. For me. And Tessa Lorimer witnessed the change. "I arranged that. Yes." He said it without flinching. "I wanted a record of her presence, of her access to the financial information. I had already been training her on the dispensing records. I had known about her grandfather's license interest for years. My father told me when I took over. I never told Tessa." "You built the framework carefully," Miss Marple said. "Not an accusation. A statement of record." "I told myself it wouldn't come to that. That I would find another solution. That the business would turn around." He looked at the amber bottles on the shelf behind him. "I increased the concentration in her tonic over 2 dispensing cycles, gradually, so that if anyone checked the earlier records, the increase would look like a cumulative error rather than a single deliberate act." He paused. "I added a potassium preparation. I told her it was a supplement Dr. Haydock had recommended. She took it without question because she trusted me." The room was very quiet. "I went to her garden Tuesday morning," he continued. "Before I opened the shop, I had left several items in her shed, the original compound, the measuring equipment. I needed to remove them before anyone thought to look." He looked at Ferry. "I oiled the gate over several weeks. I kept a spare key to the shed cut last summer, when she asked me to bring in some garden tools during a spell of bad weather, and trusted me with hers to copy." He stopped. "She trusted me completely. That is the thing I cannot—" He stopped again. Miss Marple said nothing. Sometimes the most useful thing one could do was to allow silence to complete a sentence that words were not adequate to finish. After a moment, Gerald said, "The bag. You noticed the bag." "Mrs. Harlow was a meticulous woman," Miss Marple said. "She would not have opened a sealed pharmacy bag in the street. But you gave her something additional that morning, the potassium preparation, in a separate packet inside the same bag. She opened the bag to retrieve it and took it on the doorstep as you had instructed before going inside, because you had told her that timing mattered for the supplement." She paused. "That is why the bag was unfolded. She had opened it immediately." Gerald nodded. "Once." "And the side door," Miss Marple said. "You opened it before the front Tuesday morning to bring the shed items in through the back of the shop rather than the high street. You were seen." "I didn't know anyone would be passing at that hour," he said. "Someone is always passing," Miss Marple said, with the particular gentleness of someone delivering a truth that has been self-evident for a long time to everyone except the person who needed it most. "In St. Mary Mead, someone is always passing, and someone is always watching. And the routines of a village are not a cover, Mr. Prescott. They are a record." She straightened her gloves, as she had straightened them on Wednesday morning outside this same pharmacy, when she had first noticed a side door opened 7 minutes too early, and a prescription collected 3 days too soon. "Constable Ferry will take your formal statement now," she said. "I would encourage you to be as complete as you have been with me. It will not reduce what has been done, but it will, I believe, be of some small importance to you in the long run, to have told the truth entirely and without being compelled to it." She stepped back from the counter. Gerald Prescott looked at her once more, a long, exhausted look, the look of a man at the end of something, and then he turned to Constable Ferry and said, "Where would you like me to begin?" Inspector Slack arrived at 9 o'clock precisely as promised, and found the matter substantially concluded, which pleased him considerably less than he felt it should have done, and which he managed by writing in his subsequent report that the confession had been obtained following rigorous police investigation with community assistance. Constable Ferry did not correct this characterization. Miss Marple did not read it. Tessa Lorimer gave a full corroborating statement that same morning, her alibi confirmed by Mrs. Patricia Dowell, who had indeed been at Willow Dip Lane at 8:30 on Tuesday. The nursing visits were recorded. The timeline was clear. The framework Gerald had constructed so carefully around her was, in the cold light of a formal investigation, entirely transparent, which was, Miss Marple reflected, the inevitable fate of frameworks built on the assumption that no one would look. The toxicological examination confirmed elevated digitalis concentration and externally administered potassium. The shed at Pump Street, secured by ferry on Friday evening, contained measuring equipment, a residue of concentrated digitalis solution in a sealed glass bottle, and wrapped in brown paper at the back of the lower shelf, a spare key to the pharmacy's side door. Gerald Prescott was arrested at 9:10 and taken to Maidstone in Inspector Slack's motor car, which was, Miss Marple thought, a fitting use of Inspector Slack that played to his particular strengths. On Sunday morning, Miss Marple attended the early service at St. Mary Mead Church and sat in her usual pew, third from the front on the left, and thought about Mrs. Edith Harlow in her brown coat that had always been slightly too large for her, walking away down a misty high street for the last time with an unfolded bag in her hand, and the 42 years of faithful attendance that deserved a better ending. The Reverend Clement spoke about the restoration of truth. It was, Miss Marple thought, the correct sermon for the occasion. She walked home through the bright, cold morning, put the kettle on, picked up her knitting, and allowed herself the small satisfaction, quiet, private, and entirely sufficient, of a tangle resolved. And there, my dear friends, our mystery draws to its close. What began with a side door opened 7 minutes too early has ended, as these things must, with the truth brought into the light where it belongs, not dramatically, not violently, but in the way of all Miss Marple's resolutions, through the patient accumulation of small observations, the refusal to dismiss what did not fit, and the deep, unwavering conviction that human nature, in its kindness and its cruelty, always leaves a record for those who are willing to look. I'm Edward, and I want to thank each and every one of you for spending this week in St. Mary Mead with us. If this story kept you company on a quiet evening, if it settled something in you that needed settling, then it has done precisely what a good mystery ought to do. Do leave a word in the comments. I read every single one. Or tell me, did you suspect Gerald from the beginning? Or did the framework he built around young Tessa draw your eye elsewhere? I find that the most perceptive among our community always notice the right thing at the right moment. And tonight, I suspect, we have had several Miss Marples of our own in the audience. Don't forget to subscribe so our cosy community keeps growing, and do come back tomorrow evening for our next story from Gentle Mysteries. Until then, good night, dear friends. Sleep well.